So today, these readings are so important to help us think about the kind of different life that St. Peter lived, St. Peter Claver lived. St. Peter Claver lived during a time in which slavery was something that was normal. It was just part of the culture. For us, we maybe, it's hard for us to even imagine, but that was just something so ingrained. And even people that would come to church day in and day out, still, they were stuck in this part of culture that was not good. And so it was so easy to just kind of follow what everyone else was doing, to look at those who had a different skin color, and to be able to say, well, if everyone else is saying that they're not really on my level, then, well, I'm just going to treat them like they were animals, like they were someone that didn't really have the same dignity as God has for me. And so that's something that someone like St. Peter Claver goes into that culture and he lives differently. He lives differently, like how in the Gospel of Luke and in the first reading today, we hear about Jesus and St. Paul talking about live your life different from the way that everyone else is going. Just because everyone is swimming this way doesn't mean that you have to necessarily swim that way too. And if you've ever seen one of my favorite TV shows now, The Chosen, and I encourage you to see, especially middle schoolers, I think you guys would really appreciate it. So it's something, talk to your families about it. It's really cool stuff. But there's this, at the beginning when they're singing this song, when the credits come on, and it's a really neat gospel song. It's about going into the water. But you have all these fish that are swimming. Have you ever seen fish, how they just kind of like salmon and stuff? They just kind of swim in a circle. They're all just sort of following each other. They're not really going anywhere. They're just kind of going like this. And you'll see this image, and all of a sudden you see a couple of those fish turn around. And they're actually swimming against the current. And that's what Jesus did when he called his first disciples. He said, follow me. Don't follow the way that everyone else is going, but open your eyes and see that I have something more for you. So Jesus says to his disciples, you heard that it was said, love your friends, hate your enemies. But he says, to you, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. If someone strikes you on the cheek, offer him your other one as well. He goes on saying, well, if you only just love the people that love you back, well, you're not different than anyone else in the world, because even people who don't know God, if someone loves them, well, they'll love them back. Or if someone's going to do something for me, I do something for them. That's not different than the rest of the world. But Jesus is saying, as a Christian, you have to be different. You have to, in a sense, shine out something even more special. Because if we're just following the same current, then people will look at your life and say, well, it doesn't really matter whether you believe in Christ or not. And even if we're doing something that's not good with our actions, then it actually sends an opposite witness. So if, like Deacon Matt and I, if we just start yelling at each other, we're not going to do that right now, but let's just say we just start yelling at each other and calling each other names and stuff like that, and then I turn and say, all right, guys, be kind. That's what Jesus wants you to do. You'd look at my life and say, you weren't really living it, so why should I follow what you're saying? If your actions aren't saying, Jesus is important in my life, if your actions aren't saying, I'm going to live in this different way from the rest of the culture. I'm going to love and I'm going to have mercy even on those who mistreat me. Now, it doesn't mean being walked over, but it doesn't mean, okay, someone says something mean to me, I'm going to send something right back at them. Isn't that temptation that happens maybe in our classes? Someone says something, someone gossips against me, I'm just going to get right back at them and gossip back. And the Lord is saying, if you follow that circle, it's just going to keep going on and on. But the radical witness is when someone says something unkind to you, you forgive them. You have mercy on them. You love them. That's a way of stopping that cycle. And it means going against the grain. In the first reading, Colossians, it gives you an image of the goal of what Christian community, what Christian brothers and sisters, how they're supposed to act. They're supposed to have a heartfelt compassion, which means they're willing to suffer with someone who's hurting. When someone is going through a bad time, do you pull away from them and say, well, I'm just going to hang out with the people that make me feel good? Or are you willing to be there and hurt with them in that moment to say, I'm here for you? To be clothed with kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, forgiving with one another, bearing with one another. If someone has a grievance against you, you have to forgive them. Clothe yourself in love and let the peace of Christ control your heart. Think about what controls your heart? What controls your decisions? Is it your emotions? I'm mad, so I'm just going to get them back. I'm angry. I don't like what my mom and dad are telling me to do, so I'm going to say those words back to them, or I'm going to do the thing in the slowest possible way, in the most grumpiest possible way to let them know I don't like this. Jesus is saying, you have to have the peace of Jesus control your heart. That needs to be the rudder of your ship so that you're going in that right way, the way that he's calling you. Because if we don't have that rudder, then we just kind of go back to the current that our whole world is going on. And if you think about it, there's a lot of yelling and shouting. There's not a lot of listening, of respecting, of loving one another. Think about maybe what do you do in social media or when you're texting? Do you say unkind things about others? Maybe even in your class, say, did you see what that person did? What a dummy. We have to think about what do we do, because that's what the rest of our world is telling us to do. To be cool, to be in the in-group, we have to be mean-spirited. We have to say those things that sort of lift us up because we're cool. And don't we see that in movies a lot of times? We have to say those words, we have to do those things, and then we have a status. And yet the Lord is saying, go against that grain and make sure that you are taking care of those that maybe are being pushed out. That's what St. Peter Claver did. St. Peter Claver, what he would do, he was a priest, he was a Jesuit priest, so the same order of Pope Francis. But he went to the Americas when they were being colonized. And if you remember, for those of you who are older and studying like the American Civil War and the African slave trade, you know that was a terrible time of inhumanity in which people would be put like they were cows, like they were animals, stuffed onto a boat. So many of them died in the midst of that. They would send them across the ocean, away from their families, away from their tribes, away, and then they would just kind of put them into a marketplace. And the people there, they didn't understand what was going on, and they even thought that they were there just to be eaten because they were being treated like they were meat and nothing else. St. Peter Claver, with several of his priests, they would come to those docks when everyone else in that culture was making fun of the people who had the black African skin. They would go into that crowd. The priests would go into that crowd. They would take their own cloaks and they would cover these men and women who had no clothes. They were shivering, they were dying, and they covered them in their cloaks. Then they took coals and made a fire and put some kind of like a sweet-smelling smoke that would actually help them inside be able to feel better. And it says that these men and women, they were looking and they were just lying there because they were dying. And people were just kind of kicking them and rolling them over and just treating them as though they were just squirrels or dogs or things like that you just kick aside. But the priests went in there and hugged them, kept them warm. And it says that these men and women who were the slaves, they looked at them with such joy in their eyes that someone actually cared for them. And the priests used their even like sign language. They used kind of different ways to show that they were there different than everyone else who was making fun of them. And they were there to tell them about someone who loved them and who created them and made them children of God. And so they would show a picture of Jesus Christ and they would say, he's the one that loves you. He's the one that became a slave so that you could be lifted up. And even though all of these people are treating you like slaves, God doesn't. And God loves you. And many of them died with that peace of knowing that they were loved. That's what it means to go into a culture in which everyone else there, even people that were going to church at times and saying, God, I love you, but they were stuck. They were blind. They didn't know what they were doing. St. Peter Claver is one of those that goes into the world and says, guys, we need to change the way that we look at our brothers and sisters. You might have grown up with this. You might have thought that this was normal, but they are equal to us, no matter the color of their skin, and they deserve dignity. That's the amazing St. Peter Claver. And he could only do this not because of his own strength, but because he loved God first. So ask the Lord, where am I called to live differently in my class? Where are those areas in which maybe there's a certain pressure to, in a sense, be mean-spirited towards someone, to exclude someone, to keep someone out of the friend circle? And be courageous like St. Peter Claver, like Jesus calls us, and instead live love.